And then we have the leader of the Federal Reserve, Chairman Ben Bernanke, over on the right, who recently has given a series of lectures, I believe it was at Georgetown, if I recall correctly, more or less just saying, oh, here's why the Fed is so great. Yeah, we make mistakes on occasion, but on the whole, we're a beneficial thing. My goal is to try to convince you today, if you're not already so convinced, that the Fed is in fact on the whole harmful, or at the very least unnecessary. Right? That it's not actually this wonderful, magical place, right, that can fix all of our economic problems. In fact, it creates many of them. Okay. So before I lay this out, just basics. What does the Fed do? In essence, it's relatively simple. Right? They control the money supply, right, in an effort, right, to guide the economy down a nice, smooth path. We've seen recently they're extremely successful at this. Right? The economy has been very, very smooth ever since its founding. After all, I mean, certainly nothing happened. But 1913 it was founded. It certainly didn't have any boom time in the 20s, right? Certainly nothing fell apart in the 30s, right? Certainly in the 70s, prices were well under control. Right? Certainly recently we haven't had any bubbles, right? Right? So maybe we should have some doubts about maybe the Fed's success, right? Just historically. Okay, so let's point out some of the ways the Fed hurts you. I have it really broken down into 3 categories. I don't think these are exhaustive. I could probably come up with more, but I was told to keep it to 20 or 30 minutes. So here we go. All right. The first one is continuous inflation. Right? Ever since the founding of the Fed, we've seen consumer prices rise regularly. I have here what prices looked like before the founding of the Fed. Right? This is in the United States. Well, I guess this goes back far enough, it would be in the colonies, 1665 all the way up to 1910. What we notice is that over the long term, things are pretty flat, right? Like prices will sometimes go up, typically during a war, right? But after the war's over, prices come right back down. Right? We have the Civil War, prices roughly double, right? Give it a couple decades, prices come right back down to where they were before the Civil War started. Right? So if we look at a long enough time period, prices are pretty stable. Right? Then we found the Fed in 1913, right? And the world changes. Right? Within the first 7 years of the creation of the Fed, prices more than doubled, and that also did coincide with the war, so maybe it's a war thing going on. But we do notice is that we eventually abandoned the gold standard in 1971. Right? At that point, prices have already risen considerably since the founding of the Fed. Since that point, well, you can see the graph better than I can, right? Right? Things have just exploded. Right? This should actually be kind of mysterious to us, right? Because one of the primary purposes of the Fed is price stability. Right? Somehow, right, we make the argument, right, we're being very successful because prices are going up 2 to 3% a year on average. Right? Okay, if my height is stable, it actually has been since 8th grade. Right? If my height is stable, I'm not getting taller every year. Right? But that's what's happening. Right? Every single year, prices are going up. Right? And it's not always within this nice 2 to 3%. Sometimes it's much higher, sometimes it's somewhat lower. Okay. All right. Just by purpose of comparison, you go all the way from 1665 all the way up to 1910. Prices rose a total over that 250 years of 5%. Total over 250 years. Since 1913, over the past 100 years or so, right, we've seen prices increase 2,300%. Right? So what you can buy for $1 now, you could buy for about 4 cents when the Fed was founded. Huge increase in prices. So that's one way the Fed hurts us. Right? We've gotten used to the fact that every year our cost of living is going up. Right? This is not normal. Right? It's something we've had to get used to in our generation, the generation before us. This has been normal, but historically it is not. Now it ends up though, we could argue maybe this isn't that bad. After all, my cost of living goes up by 3% and my income goes up by 3%, I'm no worse off. Right? My income is keeping track with prices, right? I'm just as well off as before. So this is something we could adjust for. Right? And that would work, right? If money worked this way. Right? I have here, this is what we call the Angel-Gabriel model. And it's one way of thinking of how money enters the economy. Right? It came from originally, I forget who it was that founded this model, but the idea was the angel Gabriel, right, uses his ability to work a miracle, right, that just doubles everybody's amount of money, whatever's in your checking account, savings account, in your pocket, whatever, it doubles it all overnight. Right? And the question is, what happens to prices on the next day? We all wake up, find out, oh, we're spectacularly wealthy, we all go out and try to spend our money. Right? It ends up, though, that we have exactly the same amount of stuff as we did the night before, right? So prices double. Right? Right? So all this money just gets absorbed in higher prices. Nobody's any better off. Right? I have twice as much money, but everything costs twice as much. On the other hand, nobody's worse off either. Right? Everything costs twice as much, but I have twice as much money, so it's okay. But that's not the way things work at all. Right? With the system with the Federal Reserve, money enters a very specific location. Right? One person gets the new money first, right? Then they spend it and it hands it over to somebody else. They spend it, it goes over to somebody else. Right? As this process continues, prices gradually rise. This means that those people that get the money first, right, they're made wealthier. Right? They get the money before prices have gone up. Right? It's as if my income just doubled, prices are all the same. I am, in fact, twice as wealthy as before. The person that gets the money last, though, right, they get the money after prices have gone up. Right? So by the time they have it, it's already worth less than it was before. Right? So they're actually made worse off. So there's this huge redistribution of wealth that goes on, right, from those that receive the money last, or made poorer, to those who receive the money first, or made wealthier. Now we can actually use the structure of our system to figure out who these people are. Right? And it has huge implications. Right? When the Fed creates money, who does it go to first? It goes to the banks. It should not be shocking in virtually any major city who has the biggest building. It's typically a bank. I drove through Akron on the way up here. I think there we have the First Merit buildings, this enormous building. We have, I think there's also a Chase building down there. It used to be Bank One. Right? There's two enormous buildings. I think the only other one in that city that matches it is First Energy. Right? So two big banks and then a utility company. I moved up here from Columbus, right, where Ohio State University is. Oh, yeah. There you go, Bucks. It's obligatory. And there, once again, huge banks everywhere. Right around the corner from where I lived on the north side of the city, this huge building for Chase, once again. Right? So is it any wonder that the banks seem to do relatively well in the system on average? Recently we've had problems, we'll get to that under the third point. Right? But on average, the banks are going to do pretty well. Right? So after the banks get the money, who do they give it to? Well, those that borrow. Right? You go out, you borrow money, and you can go out and buy stuff with that new money. Right? That makes you wealthy. Another benefit is that by the time you have to pay the money back, right, it's worth less, right, which is nice. Right? Who is it that's ultimately hurt? Right? It's those who save and don't take advantage of this process. So what kind of incentive have we created? If you want to be the first person in line getting the new money before it is worth less, you have to borrow a lot. Right? Isn't it any wonder? Coming from education, we all know tuition prices are astronomical. Right? They've increased far faster than the rate of consumer prices. We also know that, you probably know better than I do, right? Students are laden with student debt. Right? Might there be a connection? If you can borrow a lot of money to go to school, might the university absorb this money you can borrow with higher prices? Right? Of course we do. Right? Thank you. Right? Right? Of course we do. Right? But you have every incentive to do this. Because it's going to lead to higher incomes for you later on, assuming you can actually get a job. Good luck nowadays, right? But it's going to be good for you, so it makes sense for you to do this. Right? We're encouraging you, right, through this process to get first in line, right, take on lots of debt, right, and we're discouraging you from being the last person in line in saving. So we've encouraged this atmosphere of indebtedness. Right? So it shouldn't be shocking. When we have, say, just coming off the housing bubble, people are taking on loads and loads of debt they cannot possibly afford to pay off. Right? It's in the system. Right? We have given them every reason to take on that debt. All right. So now let's move on to the last point, which I guess is more my specialty. It's business cycles. Right? Victoria listed off all the official things that I study. That's where you have to understand I come from a school of thought we call Austrian economics. Have we heard of Austrian economics here? Yeah, typically you're more likely to hear about it if you're at say, a YAL meeting than anywhere else, right? When I was in graduate school, I'd say, I'm studying the Hayek theory of the business cycle. And everybody knows Hayek, so I thought this was safe. He got a Nobel Prize, right? I saved this to actually one of the older members of the faculty there, and he said, Hayek had a business cycle theory. Yes, that's one of the reasons he got the Nobel Prize. Right? You should know this. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what their business cycle theory is like coming from this school of thought. You notice Austrian business cycle theory is not on that list, right? Because very few people know what it is, right? Outside of a pretty limited group. Right? So I'm hoping to introduce you to this so you can kind of understand the story. If you've heard about it before, there are lots of ways of telling this story. It captures different elements. So the way that I say it might be a little bit different than you've heard before. It just fills out the picture a little bit more in that case. Okay, so to really get the story, let's start by thinking not about the economy as a whole. That's huge, lots of people, hard to think about. Let's think about one person, Robinson Crusoe, on the island by himself. Naturally shipwrecked on an island, his standard of living is not very good. He has to spend most of his day gathering food to ensure that he doesn't starve. So let's just say there are berries that he can collect. As he collects these berries, he has a choice of what he can do. He can consume these berries, and feel very nice and full when he goes to bed at night. Bed in the sand, but he can feel full while he's trying to sleep. Or he can, if he wants, just eat enough to survive and set some berries aside for the future, in case something should happen. So if he wants to better his life, what might he do? Well, it seems a sensible possibility. We're on this island, the weather's not necessarily always perfect, even in paradise. Right? Having a shelter is a good thing. Right? So what could he do? Spend several days, pick as many berries as I can, right? Only consume what I need to survive, set aside the rest. Right? This then gives me some time, right, during which I can eat those berries I've saved, right, and build a house, right? A shack at the very least, right? Something to protect me from the weather. Right? So this is going to be a very normal, stable way that he could handle this. Right? Save up for the future. When the future gets here, I can then invest my time in this big project. Right? And I have enough saved up so that I can survive during this project. Right? Now what he probably would not want to do would be just eat as much as he possibly can, then one day say, oh, I'm going to start building a shelter, and start doing so. Right? That night, he's going to know that there's something wrong. Right? He didn't spend any time collecting berries. He didn't have any berries saved up. He's pretty hungry. Right? Now he could, right, if he wanted to, try to refuse his hunger pangs. No, I'm going to finish, right, this project that I've started and keep going for several days, right, until eventually he collapses from exhaustion and starvation and dehydration and what have you, right? And he ends up dead. This is not a sensible way to go about planning his personal economy. It's much better for him to save up first, right, and then know that he can get through that time to make his life better. Okay, so it's kind of a weird analogy, but we can kind of see the business cycle in it. Right, if he doesn't save up beforehand, right, he can try to make this big investment in a house, right, but he's not going to be able to complete it. Right? He can't survive to the point where it's completed. Right? So how do we apply this then to a larger scale? Right? Say the economy as a whole. Right? It doesn't scale up perfectly. Right? Very few of us are saving berries. My wife does because she likes them. Right? If we run out, though, it's not that big a deal. We go to Giant Eagle and buy more. Right? So it's not a perfect analogy. But what is it? What is this analogy? Right, well, I think in a typical time, right, if we want to better our society and make ourselves wealthier, right, people need to save. Right? We need to set aside money that can then be invested by those entrepreneurs who have good ideas, right, good long-term projects that are going to, in the end, make us wealthier. Right? But these long-term projects are only going to work out, right, if at the end of the time, it takes time to produce things, but at the end of that time, people actually have money to buy the product. Right? If they've saved, they have the money. So we're okay. So as long as we go through this process, I save, that money's taken and invested in the economy, they create a product, then I can take my savings and buy that product, everything's fine and stable. But what the Federal Reserve does is something much more akin to having Robinson Crusoe not save his berries. Because whenever they want to stimulate the economy, what do? They take new money, put it in the banking system, as we said before. But as the banks have new money, right, now they have to lend it out. There's very little point in just sitting on it, so they lend it out. But in order to lend it out, we have to find people that are willing to borrow. To find people that are willing to borrow, we have to lower the interest rate, to convince them that it's worthwhile to borrow from us. So new money enters the credit markets, interest rates fall. As interest rates fall, it makes sense for investors to go out and borrow money, start building new factories, start building new houses, start these huge long-term projects. Right? It's very cheap to do so. When it's cheap to do so, it makes sense. At the same time, when interest rates fall, it makes no sense for us whatsoever to save a lot of money. Okay, do I want to put money in my savings account nowadays? Probably not. I think I'm getting like 0.01% on my savings account. Right? It doesn't make any sense for me to save. Right? I'll go out and I'll spend my money, enjoy it while I have it, right, before it loses value. Right? So at the same time, what's going on? Right? We're taking on huge long-term projects. It's very cheap to do so. Right? Borrowing money is very cheap. So take on these huge projects on the entrepreneurial side. Meanwhile, those savers who are going to need to have that money if they're going to actually buy the stuff people produce in the future, right, aren't saving. In fact, they're saving less because it makes less sense for them to save. Eventually, we hit the point where this all comes to a head. Right? We're starting to complete these projects. We have product. We're ready to go out and market it. But nobody has the money to buy it. Now, for a while, we can maybe keep this going. After all, if we keep pumping money into the credit markets, right, then okay, I don't have the savings to buy it, but I can go out and I can borrow to buy this thing. What happens then? Well, the only way that can work is if we keep pumping money into the credit markets. The more and more money enters the economy, the higher and higher prices are going to go. Now, we already know in the past 100 years we've seen 2,300% increase in consumer prices. This is actually considered not that bad compared to many countries. More recently, just a few years ago, we saw Zimbabwe actually see how this can work out, right, when we don't limit ourselves with how much money we're creating. You put a lot of money into the economy, it becomes virtually worthless. Prices rise so high that nobody even wants to hold money. Right? They try to spend it on anything before the money loses value. Right? So, we have a choice. Are we going to keep pumping money into the economy until the money's worthless? We're going to stop pumping money into the economy, at which point we find out we can't actually afford, right, all of these wonderful things people have produced for us. What does that mean? If I can't afford to buy your product, you go out of business. That's the way it works. Right? So, that's, in a nutshell, right, the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Right? New money enters credit markets, this pushes interest rates down. With interest rates being low, we undertake long-term projects with very little saving. As a result, these long-term projects cannot be completed profitably. Okay. Let's apply that to a recent situation. Here I have what is probably the most familiar business cycle. It's the one we've lived through most recently. Right? Here we have the housing market. I would note that a house is really a very long-term investment. When you build a new house, you expect it to last for decades. And so this is really, in some way, a long-term investment project. I'm building a house that's going to continue to serve me, right, for years after years after years. Okay, so how did the story work out here? You can see very early on, right, these three lines that start relatively high and drop, those are all different interest rates. The lowest one is the Fed funds rate. It's the one that Fed actually targets and tries to manipulate. In consequence, though, they do affect other interest rates. Being the other two here would be different types of mortgages, adjustable rate mortgages being that middle line that's dipping, and fixed rate mortgages being the upper one. We can notice, though, they started relatively high. Coming off of the tech bubble, we had relatively high interest rates, but they fell rather rapidly as we're trying to deal with the recession, right, that comes off of the tech bubble. Right? But as interest rates fall, what do we want to do? Well, let's go out and build new houses or buy existing houses. Right? This increased demand for houses drives housing prices up. As we see in the line that starts relatively low and shoots way up, it's the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. It's a standard way of measuring home prices. It starts low, goes up as interest rates fall. But eventually what do we start seeing? Right? Come right around the time you see our interest rates have more or less flattened out and start going up. Why were they going up? Well, the Fed is worried about price stability. Prices have started going up. Right? We cannot, right, allow hyperinflation to take hold. Right? So we have to let interest rates rise. As interest rates go up, what happens? Those people who have taken adjustable rate mortgages find their houses are no longer affordable. When I took out this loan, I was paying 3-4% interest. Right? Now suddenly my interest is 6%. I was just getting by as it was. Or there's no way that I can possibly afford my house anymore. Right? Those people that are thinking about maybe buying a home, suddenly it's less attractive. Right? Used to be interest rates were much lower. Now they're higher. I don't want to buy a home anymore. What happens to housing prices? We notice they start to level off as interest rates rise and eventually start crashing. People that can't afford their home now have to sell it. Increased sale pressure pushes down the price of housing. So we can actually tell the story of the housing boom and bust, right, in terms of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Push down interest rates that led to this boom, and this time it happened to be focused on housing. It's not always focused on housing. But the time before this was largely focused on the internet and tech bubbles. Right? Tech bubbles, yeah. Tech stocks. Right? Right. Okay. So this time it was housing. Push down interest rates, housing prices go up. Interest rates rise, housing prices come back down. And we found that it's been an absolute disaster for us. Right? People have taken on huge amounts of debt. Right now their houses aren't worth enough to pay off their mortgages. Right? That's a hard situation. Right? Okay. Well, normally if I can't afford my house, I try to sell it. This time I can't afford to sell it because for me to pay off my mortgage, I need to come up with cash. Right? It's horrible. Right? So I guess in some sense, this is far worse precisely because it was in housing rather than something else. Right? But that's not something we could predict from the Austrian business cycle theory, it's just a consequence. All right. So there are three ways that the Fed hurts us that I've talked about. Right? One is continuously increasing consumer prices, right? A huge jump ever since the founding of the Fed. The second, this redistribution of wealth, right? Away from our savers, right, to our borrowers and to banks. And the third being the business cycle, right? That is the Fed, through decreasing interest rates, actually sows the seeds of having to raise interest rates and leading to recessions. So what then can we do? There's just 3 points of reform we can possibly consider. The first one is ending the Fed. This is something, it's really kind of wild. Even if you talk to people that are somewhat critical of the Fed, they tend to say, well, the problem is the Fed's not doing its job quite right. It needs to do something a little bit different. John Taylor is one, a brilliant guy from Stanford. He came up with the Taylor rule. Right? It's supposed to be the perfect way to run Fed policy. Right? And he complains, oh yeah, the problem is interest rates are low right now. Right? They should be higher than they are, according to my rule. But he doesn't suggest something as radical as ending the Fed. Right? Maybe the Fed makes so many mistakes. Maybe by its very nature, right, it's going to make these mistakes. So we need to consider something more radical, actually getting rid of it. I'd note, it's not only those who would consider themselves Austrians that would say this is the right path to go down. Right? Milton Friedman, who relatively recently passed away, right, he was a very big critic of the Fed. Right? He thought eliminating it was in fact the way to go, despite the fact that he came out, he said, no, I think Hayek and Mises, these Austrians, are wrong about the business cycle. Right? He still thought there was a perfectly good reason to end the Fed. Just based on the fact that if we have one organization that can do as much damage as the Fed can do, right, and that we have very little, there's very little accountability here as well. Right? If one organization caused that much damage, he says it just shouldn't exist. Right? We need to organize things a different way. Right? So end the Fed. It's something that is actually getting some play now thanks to Ron Paul, right, writing books along these lines. Right? We should end the Fed. Right? We should actually put the Fed on the table as something worth thinking about. Right? Maybe ending rather than just refining. Second reform. Right? The question then comes up, what should we do, right? If we don't have the Fed, who's going to control the money supply now? Right? To a certain degree, like, we feel good knowing that somebody's in control of things, right? We kind of imagine, and often I think that economics professors are very bad about encouraging us to think these ways, right? Saying, well, the Fed is kind of like the driver of a car. Right? And when things are looking bad, we push on the gas pedal to speed things up. That improves the economy. When things are looking like they're overheating, what that looks like, I don't really know. Right? You don't want to take this too literally, I guess. But that's the problem, isn't it? Right? Oh, when things are overheating, we hit the brakes. Right? That slows things down. We stabilize the drive. Right? So then if we take this analogy and say, end the Fed, what are we really saying? Right? Well, let's take the driver, drag them out of the car, and see what happens. Right? Obviously not a good plan, right, if we believe the analogy. Right? But the reality is that the Fed is not like the driver of a car. Right? The economy is not something as mechanical as a car that works in these predictable ways. If so, the Fed would probably do its job well. Right? Right? That's not the way the economy works. Right? The economy is made up of millions upon millions of people throughout the world, billions of people, right, each making decisions about the resources we have and the needs we want to satisfy. Right? Right? Taking the Fed out of the picture doesn't change that. It's just one less big player to mess things up. Right? Right, so what can we do instead? I really like the idea, what I've mentioned here is the idea of having a free market in money. Right? Allow people to produce different monies. This was an idea presented by Hayek as a way of dealing with this. Right? Right, so if I wanted to go out and print Engelhardt dollars, I could. Right? Right? Very few people would probably accept them. Right? I don't have anything backing them. But maybe they'd accept them if I said, well, in fact, for every Engelhardt dollar that's out there, I have a certain amount of gold. Right? Right? If you don't trust the dollar that I've printed, just bring it to me, I'll hand you the gold. Right? Okay, now we know that gold is something that at the very least we can make rings out of. Right? There's some value attached to it. Right? So just allow people, or banks, or whomever, right, to create whatever money they want, and let the market sort it out. That's the way we handle most decisions. Right? Allow different people to produce different products, put them into the marketplace and see who wins. We see right here, I'm reading the notes for this talk off of my new iPod Touch. I was very excited about getting this. Yeah, I should have saved more before I bought it, but it's the system we live in. Right? Okay. Right? What does this prove? Well, Apple produced a product that people want. Right? We didn't have any central authority declaring, oh, we need to figure out how many iPod Touches we're going to make and similar things, or we're not squashing those that are trying to make similar things either. Right? But in fact, we do if you try to produce some kind of bill to compete with Federal Reserve notes. If you try to compete with the Federal Reserve, you end up in prison. If you want proof of this, I'd suggest you go Google Liberty Dollar. Right? It was a man who tried to make a currency that was backed by silver. Right? And as far as I know, he at least was in prison. I believe he still may be, right? Because it's illegal for you to try to compete with Federal Reserve notes in the United States. Right, so let's free it up. Let's allow. In fact, I'm perfectly fine, even if we don't do reform number 1, let's do reform number 2. Right? Right, let's force the Federal Reserve to act in competition with others. And make them actually make what they have be a desirable product rather than something that's going to lose value year after year. Okay. All right, the third reform, and it's a possibility, I've not really touched much on the reasons for this, would be something like 100% reserves. If you want to know more about this, feel free to ask in the question and answer session. One of the problems we have in our banking system is that it's not just the Fed that creates new money. Right? Banks can do this as well through the loan process. Right? So that can actually also lead to business cycles. Right? So occasionally, Austrians are challenged, right? Oh, but we had business cycles before 1913. Right? How do you explain that? Right? Banks created new money and it had the same effect as if the Fed did it. Right, so 100% reserves would be a way around that. Alternatively, there is something they call free banking, which I think would also serve this purpose. More or less, free banking allows banks to decide how much money they want to create, but holds them accountable if they create too much and end up with runs on their bank and they fail. Right? We know nowadays we don't actually hold banks accountable. Right? You have problems at your bank, oh, we'll come up with the money somehow, print it, whatever, right, to make sure your bank doesn't fail. So really free banking, I think the central part of that we don't have in our system is actually holding banks accountable to the decisions that they make. So these are just 3 different paths for reform. So I hope that today I've at least given you some ammunition or food for thought. Maybe the Fed is not this magical place that runs the economy perfectly. Right? Maybe in fact they make mistakes, and those mistakes that they make are big enough and fundamental enough that we should question the institution itself. Thank you. Turn it over to questions. Yeah?
Do you think that, because on that graph that sort of inflation shooting up around the turn of last century, does that account for the fact that sort of industrialization of sort of this entire economy? Because I feel like sort of the creation of the Fed isn't the only thing that's going on. It had maybe a large role.
Right. There, actually industrialization, kind of the effect we'd expect to see is the opposite of this. Because what goes on with industrialization is that we can produce more stuff, right? We're becoming more efficient. Right? If we're producing more stuff and the amount of money in the economy is the same, it's going to tend to push prices down. Right? To a certain degree, we can kind of see an explanation. I think I need to go back another slide here. Is that the one from 1665 to 1910? Is that right? Okay. Part of what was happening, say from 1860 toward the late 1800s, was a big part of the Industrial Revolution happening right here in the U.S. Okay. So part of this drop in prices we see there could actually be part of that process. I think George Selgin is somebody that makes that point, and that if we're becoming more productive, right, that should drop prices. Right? So it might be that there are times that prices are actually steady, right, or they should be falling, right, if we're becoming more productive. Yeah. So there might be other explanations, but I think industrialization would push us the wrong direction here. Other questions? Yes, sir?
What exactly is that, this like price index that you're using here?
It's a CPI kind of index, right? They didn't actually start calculating the CPI until right around 1913. I'm pretty sure that it's not a coincidence, the dates. But going back, using various historical statistics, we kind of construct a similar price index, right, to try to make it comparable. I got all of these from a history of the American economy textbook. Right? Had all this listed. Actually, it was in, it tells you how lazy professors are. I open up to the back cover. Oh, here, CPI, 1665 every 5 years, all the way through 20 I think it was 2005. It was a little bit of an old textbook, and then I updated it from there. Yeah, so it's something like the CPI. Naturally, the composition is going to be much different the further back you go. People weren't buying the same things then as we're buying now. But the idea is about the same. Yeah.
So if we were sort of didn't have the Fed, then we'd have sort of elimination of business cycles, or how would that change? I feel like business cycles are caused by things beyond just sort of investment. It could also be caused by just technology.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not one that. It depends on who you talk to. Some Austrians are kind of extreme in believing that's the only cause of business cycles. I'm not that far. Right. No, I think there are other things that can cause things that look like business cycles. Right, like actually Victoria mentioned, I do some real business cycle theory research. Right? And there the story is all, it's just changes in technology and policy right, that make us more productive and less, and that's driving the business cycle. And I think it's true that fluctuations would come from these kinds of things. Right? I would see increases and decreases. But at the same time, with that story, it's not really a true cycle, right, if you think about it. Because what makes something a cycle is that it goes up and then comes down. Right? It goes up and comes down. That's what a cycle does. With something like a technology increase, yeah, that's going to make us more productive, we produce more, we're wealthier. It's not obvious why this would come down. Right? So, and now it happens, I actually have a graph, I don't have it with me at the moment, maybe I do, right, is that if you take, say, a bunch of random changes, right, throw them on a graph, right, it looks cyclical. Right? So it could be, okay, we had an increase in productivity, that led to a boom. Right? Then we made some bad policy decisions, so we became less productive. And that looks like a bust. It's not really a true cycle, though. Because two different things happen at different times in different directions. Where the Austrian story is actually a true cycle. Right? Push down interest rates, that leads to the boom. We start all of these big investment projects. Once we complete them or come close to completing them, nobody has the money to buy them, that leads to the bust. So it's all part of one story. Yeah, so I'd say fluctuations might happen, but something like ending the Fed, I think, removes one cause of business cycles. Certainly not all of them, in my mind. Yeah.
You could argue that because we're such an internationalized economy now, that other foreign banks would have influence on the U.S. money supply and inflation, despite ending the Fed or reforming it. How would that increase or decrease what we're seeing here?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Have you read my paper about that? No, it was actually something I worked on. Was it summer of 2004? I was working down at the Mises Institute, as one of the think tanks that sponsors education in Austrian economics. If you want to know more about it, come to Mises University. Right? I'm very excited in that I'm actually going to be teaching some there this summer, which is kind of cool. Yeah, but I wrote a paper about that, in that it is possible, right, if we have other countries that don't play the game well, right, they keep their central banks and keep doing these kinds of things, that can lead to us being victims as long as we're part of one capital market, right, which is true. At the same time, there's the question of, are we making it better or worse, right, in our own system? And it's just that there is some possibility, in theory, we could make it better. Right? If they're pumping money into their economy, we can try to suck it out of ours to balance it all out. There are good reasons not to do that, so we tend not to. It tends, everybody inflates at the same time. Right? Everybody collapses at close to the same time is the way the economy seems to work now. So in that case, we eliminate the Fed. It's a pretty big central bank in terms of the world scale. So that's one big reason. Right? That things would at least get better. Could we totally fix it with just eliminating that? I don't think so. Right? We still have the European Central Bank to worry about. We still have the Bank of Japan and so forth. But it would make things better. Right? And similarly, even if we just consider keeping the Fed, right, but they don't put as much money into the economy, right? Okay, then we get a smaller effect. Right? Fewer long-term projects get started, fewer would then fail. Right? So it's kind of, by analogy, the same idea. On a world scale, you eliminate the Fed, it's like we're increasing the money supply, but somewhat less. Right? So it would lessen the effects. Yeah. So yeah, we like to think, oh, right, we would just fix everything if we made this one reform. Right? I don't think it would. Right? But it could make things better. Right? So, is that the kind of change we want to make, I guess is the question I'd ask. Other questions?
little confused about sort of the mechanics of the
Mhm.
Fed giving money to commercial banks.
Mhm. Right.
How does that
Sure.
work? They just run some money off and then just hand them a big stack with a dollar sign on it? Or?
Right, yeah. If only we're that real, right? In reality, more what it is, right? The Fed says, oh, well, we want to put new money into the system, right? So we're going to go out and we're going to buy government bonds, right? Government bonds, banks hold a lot of them, right? So it's actually largely just an electronic thing that happens, right? The Fed changes, so now we have these assets that are now government bonds on our balance sheet. Now you, as this bank, you have more reserves with the Federal Reserve, right? It's the cash, right? It's purely electronic that goes to them. And then those banks can take that and lend it out. Right? Often when they lend it out, it's not, that we then print the bills and hand it to somebody. Right? I've actually never been to a bank to get a loan, oddly enough, but I'm pretty sure they don't hand you a suitcase full of money, right? No, instead, it's, okay, here's an account you draw from, more or less. Right? Functionally, that's more or less the way it works. Right? So, yeah, sadly, there are no bags with dollar signs on them. That'd make it somewhat easier to explain. I could put pictures up here. But it's all electronic.
Okay.
But it's, in effect, the same idea.
And the Fed is also in charge of interest rates on government bonds, right?
No.
Not really?
Not really. They try to affect that market, but they're not really in charge of it. Yeah, what they have this tightest control over, let me pull up that graph again, is this bottom line here, the very dark black line that bottoms out at 2002, 2004. That's the federal funds rate. Those are on very, very short-term loans. They're actually overnight loans between banks. And the Fed intervenes in this market, providing new funds or taking funds out to control this interest rate pretty tightly. Then this, in turn, has an effect on other interest rates. And now we have actually seen recently the Fed intervening more directly into government bond markets, where they're actually going out, buying up a bunch of long-term debt from the government. And in effect, what is this doing? It's providing new funds for long-term purposes, driving down long-term rates is the goal. It's kind of unusual. We live in unusual times. Normally, it's really the Fed funds story. Now we do actually have the Fed trying to affect these things, but they don't really control them. Because if they act hard enough, maybe they can. It's a big market. Yeah.
It's just a little simpler, I guess. How much of it just about going back to the gold standard and one central currency still?
Mm-hmm. I like that system. Yeah, I do. The only challenge, I guess, in my mind about it is getting there. Right. So it's actually something where, it wouldn't necessarily be that hard. Right? The Fed actually still has gold, sitting there in vaults in, I believe, in New York, maybe in Fort Knox, I don't know. They actually have physical gold. If they wanted to, they could say, here's the number of dollars in existence, here's the amount of gold, do the division, this many dollars per ounce of gold. You can come redeem it and we'll hand you the gold. We could do that. I think Murray Rothbard actually recommends that as a path. Pretty easy to implement. The politics of it get nasty, right? Okay, because what is this actually going to do? Right? Given how many dollars are now in existence and how much gold we have, the price of gold would skyrocket. Right now we're looking over $1,000 an ounce. I forget what the numbers are now. I did the math a while back and it was going to be something like $2,500 an ounce. But that was before the huge increases in the money supply we've had over the past couple of years. Right? So it's going to be even more than that. Right? So effectively, what are we doing when we do that? Well, nobody wants to buy wedding rings anymore. Huge decreases in marriage rates, because gold has become very expensive, in effect. So that makes it a hard political sell. I like it as a plan because I think ultimately, I actually believe that if we followed point number 2, we'd see precious metals, silver, gold, maybe even platinum, I don't know, emerge as being victorious in the market. Because they're going to hold their value. We can't get that much more of them. It's not like paper that we can just print more money. And so I think they're going to have more stable value if they're allowed to compete. So I guess in a way, currency competition is kind of a backdoor to get gold in there and give it a chance. Maybe it'll be something else, I don't know. I think gold has a good shot. Yeah.
How are other money sort of different monies compete with each other, like compete
Mhm.
compared to sort of the American, like the right now one systems. At least that, you know, the federal government behind it.
Mhm.
Big imposing factor. How
Yeah.
would you work about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess when I think about it, right, there are other countries that have adopted the dollar. Right? For example, in Ecuador is one, right, they use the dollar. Right? Right? Despite the fact that technically it's the U.S. government that's backing it. Right? It ends up, I think the better argument is it's not actually the government backing the dollar. It's people's confidence in it. Right? If we all decided, no, the dollar's worthless, I'm not going to use it anymore, right? I don't think the government has enough guns to force us to. Right? There are lots of us. Right? They can shoot a lot of us, but it's probably not worth it. Right? Right? You know, I hate to make it sound silly, right? Right? But ultimately, it's confidence that backs up these things, which is where, for example, in Zimbabwe, totally destroyed their own currency. Right? They switched over to things like the dollar, which is more stable, the euro, that's also relatively more stable. I actually think Zimbabwe is a good example, and that there we do actually have two currencies that, at least for a while, were competing side by side. People were using both the euro and the dollar; they're both available in the economy. Right? It shows we can actually have these things operate side by side, possibly.
But how sort of non-state
Mhm.
money, like how would a private institution of some sort get that much confidence? Because I can't imagine even some large company in the States are going to have that much.
Yeah, that's a good question, right? It's something that'd be hard to do, which is where I think ultimately you'd have to have something backing it, right? Right? Like I could actually imagine, let's see if I have me with me, right? I could see something like, no, not that. Maybe I don't have me with me. Spin them all. Right? Okay. I don't have any gift cards with me, right? But what is a gift card really, right? In a sense, right, it's kind of a money that's been created by a private company. Because I handed them some dollar bills and they gave me like, this card that has a very specific use. Right? But it is possible, we could imagine, say, I don't know, Best Buy gift cards trading for $25 a piece, if that's the value on the card. Because in effect, it's something that's redeemable in $25 worth of stuff. Right? Which is actually what the original gold standard was kind of based on. Right? This idea, I have these bills, right? I can go and I can turn them in for gold. Right? So if I don't like the bills, well, there's something that I do trust behind it. Same thing with Best Buy gift cards. Right? If I don't trust Best Buy to redeem this gift card, I'll just go really fast, right, to get an iPod Touch. Right? Something that I do actually trust and at least can use. Right? Yeah, so I could see it happening that way, right? Possibly. Or, yeah, once again, people just coming up with something else, yeah. Re-implementing a private gold standard. We saw the guy try it with silver. Right? Apparently he had enough success, right, that he caught the attention of the federal government. Right? Okay. Right? If he was really just nuts, right, I would really be concerned about arresting him. I don't know. Yeah, so, but I think there are ways. Right? And I'm also going to try never to underestimate the creativity of the market. And we're talking about 7 billion people in this world, right, trying to solve the problem. Right? Even though I'm not that creative, I might not be able to think of a solution. Well, it's a good someone out there can. Right? So, I tend to have a lot of confidence in humanity. Right? Give them a problem, we're going to find a solution. If it is physically possible, we'll find a solution. Other questions? Yeah.
I think we're all going to agree that reform number 1 is great, and reform number 2 is nice as well, but the politics behind them are very hard to get involved in.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit more what you're talking about with reform number 3?
Okay. Let's see. Reform number 3. How much detail do you want?
Go ahead.
All right. All right. It might be easier with the chalkboard. I'm kind of addicted to the chalkboard. And my students all hate me because my handwriting is atrocious, but I use the chalkboard anyway. Okay, so 100% reserves, right? And what's the idea? So what normally happens in our modern banking system? I take money to the bank, right? I deposit, say, $100 into my checking account. Now, most of the time, nowadays it's kind of unusual because banks aren't giving very many loans, but most of the time, the bank will take that $100, set aside 10 in reserve in case people want to withdraw stuff. Right? 10 is what's required. take the other 90, lend it out to somebody else. And so we'd say we have a fractional reserve system. Right? Of deposits, only a fraction is held in reserve, roughly 10% in our system. A 100% reserve system would take that and change it to where if I go and I deposit $100 into my checking account, they have to keep $100 in reserve. Right? So deposits wouldn't then be what leads to loans. We'd need something else. I would suggest, before people start getting too worried, we already have in place ways that we can make loans without banks being involved. The bond market is one case of that. If I want to borrow money in the bond market, I sell a bond. Right? There's no deposit involved here, no need for any kind of reserves. Right? So what a 100% reserve system would in effect do would be divide the banking system. So we'd have deposit banks, right? They would take deposits and really act like money warehouses. Store my money here because it's safer than under my mattress. Right? And they'd probably charge me a fee for this. Right? They do this now anyway. Right? So we'd have that side. The other side would be loan banking, right? Where I might go and I buy bonds or buy shares in a mutual fund that then goes out and gives loans, that kind of thing. Right? So it's dividing these two things that now are mixed together. Would be what 100% reserves would effectively do. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Would that then like drastically decrease sort of the supply of loans and stuff? Because so that would just hurt the economy because people couldn't make profitable investments and investment companies.
Yeah, that tends to be one of the first concerns coming to our mind. Right? But then we think, like, what consequences would result from this? Right? One would be that, say, a savings account is a deposit. Right? Like, would a bank pay me interest on a savings account anymore? Right? Well, it wouldn't make any sense. Right? They can't use that for anything. Right? So all this money that goes into savings accounts, I'm having to pay now to keep there. Right? So, okay, do I really want to put it in a savings account, or do I want to put it somewhere where I might earn something? Right? These mutual funds that buy bonds, say. Right? So I think we'd see a big shift, right? Because right now we tend to save a lot in savings accounts. I think we'd see a shift away from that toward things like these mutual funds that buy bonds. Right? Now I wouldn't be surprised if there were some decrease in funds available for loans. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. But I'm not convinced that that's totally a bad thing. Right? Just because I think there are lots of loans out there that really probably shouldn't actually exist. Right? Things like a car loan. Right? Okay, you take out money, you buy this car, you drive it off the lot, and now you're upside down on your car loan. Right? Is that really the kind of thing we should be borrowing money for? Things like, I would tend to agree with students that tuition is just outrageously too high. I'm not sure that tuition loans should at least be as common as they are. Right? I think we can probably find ways to make tuition more affordable. Right? You can perhaps prove that by looking at, say, someplace like where I teach, our tuition is relatively low. Right? We're a branch campus for Kent State University. It's pretty low tuition. No more than $10,000 a year. I think it's less than that. Right? Students taking my course, I think, pay $700 for those credit hours. Right? For all three, right? Right? For all 3 credit hours in my class. Right? And so you add it up, 12 credit hours, 700 times 4. And so we were paying, what, $6,000 a year? Wow, less than I thought. Right? Okay, that becomes more affordable. Right? And that proves, right, that somebody can do this. Right? Right? So we don't have to charge $20,000 a year. Right? But there's a way to do it more efficiently. Right? Right? Okay. Right? So I think there's a lot of these loans that, if they were less available, right, it might lead to consequences that are actually a good thing. Maybe. Right? But a lot of this is naturally speculation. Right? I've not run the experiment, or they've not let me. Right? So I can't say for sure. Right? But I think that there are solutions out there. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't really see what the difference is between the 100% reserves world and the world we live in right now. I can go to the store and buy a safe and throw a bunch of cash in there, and now I'm living in the 100% reserve world.
Yes.
But people choose not to do that. It seems like if I opened a bank that functioned like a loan bank, that would be every bank that exists in the world right now, and people choose to use them anyway. So I guess I just don't see where the reform is.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess it is technically true, right, that even at existing banks, right, I don't have to put my money on deposit. I can buy a safety deposit box, put the cash in there. Right? That's, in fact, literally a money warehouse at that point. That's true. It's true. But I guess here the question is, right, it's really all in how we think of the money we put on deposit, right? And that I still think of it as being my money, right, that I can spend, even though 90% of it isn't there anymore, right? And that creates a big potential for instability, right, in these banks, which I didn't mention before. When we have a fractional reserve system, we need to be very concerned about the kinds of scenes we see in, a couple great movies, Mary Poppins, right? We have a bank run, right? The problem, right, the reason that they don't want to give everybody their money is because they don't actually have it, right? It's been invested, right? As Jimmy Stewart explains, it's in so-and-so's house, so-and-so's house, so-and-so's house, right? It's not here in a safe, right? Which is a problem if we still think of it as our money that I can take out anytime I want, right? Because we need to make sure that only 10% of people decide they want to take it out at any one time, or we have serious problems, right? 100% reserve system would solve that problem. So it would make the system more stable. Because when I put money in, say, a mutual fund, I understand the value is going to change. Right? I don't expect to be able to redeem it at par. Right? Whereas my checking account, I do expect to be able to do that. Right? So there's a potential for a bank run there, right? Not so much with these mutual funds. Right? It's different. So, yeah, I think it's true. Right? If personally I want 100% reserves, I can do that now. Right? That's true. There's still the instability in the system, right, that can create problems. That ultimately can affect me. Yeah.
Wouldn't a lot of that go away if you have this 100% reserves, that would sort of eliminate inflation to an extent? I feel like that's the reason why putting money in the bank makes sense, is because even a savings account's going to be, somewhere in the ballpark of inflation, so at least your money's sort of not losing value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I guess nowadays it's not really true.
Generally.
Yeah, generally, right. Generally they're at least close. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I don't know that I'd say that 100% reserves would eliminate inflation, right? But it would actually move us that direction, wouldn't it? And that part of the way money gets created is the banks create it, right, through this relending process. Right? So that part would be cut off by 100% reserves. So yeah. It would certainly limit inflation to just what the Federal Reserve creates, right, directly, rather than allowing banks to add to the process. Which actually, as I think about it, that would make it pretty small. Right? Look at the money supply as a whole, relatively little was directly created by the Fed. Okay, more now than usual, right? But most of it ends up being created by banks. So yeah, so we would actually get that effect. I've not thought too much about that, but that's true. Other questions? I like this, it's fun. Yeah.
One more delving into the speculation of this. If you have the two kind of banking systems, with a money warehouse bank and then a mutual fund bank,
yes,
who's buying up bonds in order to essentially give out loans,
yes,
would you have then private individuals who are in essence selling bonds in order to get loans?
Yeah. Actually, it's kind of weird, but that's more or less what happened, and it has been happening for about the last 40 years or more, actually, in the securitization market, right? So it's not, I'm not going out, here's, $150,000 bonds so I can buy a house, right? But in effect, that's what's happening, right? And then we have the securitizers, I'm sure there's a technical term, right? And I'm not going to use it, right? Those that are writing these securities give me the loan and then go out and sell the bonds, right? So in effect, that is something that's already happening. And then, right, nowadays, right, banks would go out and buy these bonds, right, until they start wondering what's inside. Right? That's part of the problem we ran into. Yeah. So I think directly, probably not. Although I remember several years ago, there were a few celebrities that were issuing personal bonds, which is kind of odd. Right? I guess people are like, oh yeah, I lent Madonna $1,000, and it makes you feel good or something. Wouldn't make me feel good, but makes some people feel good, right? Get a thrill. Right? Yeah, so you might see some people do it. I don't think that'd be very common, right? I think the securitization process, right, is much more likely what we would see happen. Yes?
So we've been talking about a 100% reserve system. What is this free banking alternative?
The free banking alternative, right, is not that, right? Instead, every bank can decide what level of reserves they want to hold, right? Which, to a certain degree, is what we do now, right? With one big difference, right? In that we'd eliminate things like, say, deposit insurance, right? right? So if I deposit money in the bank, right, and then they lend out part of it and for some reason can't collect it, then I'm out my money. So as a depositor, I care what my bank does. Nowadays, it's not true. Put my money in the bank, as long as you don't have $250,000, I don't, right? It doesn't matter what the bank does with it. The money's guaranteed, right? So that's one thing, we'd have no deposit insurance. Right? So, okay, banks can lend out as much as they want, as long as they can find depositors willing to lend the money. Right? Another point would be that we actually hold banks accountable, so no bailouts either. Right? So no deposit insurance, no bailouts. Right, so it ends up, there's a reasonable argument out there, and I think it's more or less true, that a free banking system, right, will look very much like a 100% reserve system. Right? Depositors don't want to lose their money, right? So they want to make sure you're not lending out too much of it. Right? Okay, if I lose 10%, that might be okay, right? But that means you have to hold 90% reserves. That's much closer to 100 than 10. Right? And there's also the problem of, in a free banking system, there's an incentive for your competing banks to try to start runs at your bank, right? Because after all, if I can shut you down, right, that decreases competition, that's good for me. Right? But a bank run doesn't work if you're holding 100% reserves. Right? Then you just tell people to get in line, right? And every single person goes and finds out, yes, their money was in fact there. Right? Right? We don't have, oh, the Mary Poppins scene is just so good. Right? It tells us so much about the banking system. Right? And then what do? Right? Right? Wonderful phrase, stop all payments. Right, so the tellers shut all the windows, right? Stop all payments, we don't have the money here in the bank. We have to stop payments. Right? If you have 100% reserves at your bank, whether it's required or not, you never have to stop all payments. Right? People just get in line. It's a long line if there's a run. But as people find out, no, in fact, the money's here, I would guess some people would say it's not worth waiting in line anymore. Right? Okay, I can actually trust them. Right? They have the money there. I'm going to go actually do something useful with my time. Right, so that's another reason we see very, very high reserves. Maybe not 100, maybe 95. Right, but enough that you would be able to deal with runs even if they're caused by your competitors. So, yeah, so I think that in the end, free banking looks very much like 100% reserves. Right? It's just not quite as strict. Right? So there's more potential for instability. But as long as our bankers aren't stupid, they probably not have too much instability. Does that clarify that at all? Yeah, the problem where you ask me a simple question, I give a very complete answer. All right, other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, I have to say with the meeting, we still talk and stuff, but
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and please take materials. Thank you very much.